Morning everyone. Today we're going to have a look at award modernisation and the equal pay case. Today's program is funded by the Australian Government and is brought to you on behalf of National Disability Services, Australian Council of Social Services and Jobs Australia. So the content for today's workshop, we're going to look at transitioning across from your old awards to the modern award and specifically the transition timetable for that. We're going to look at penalties and loadings and how we phase those across from your old awards to the modern SCHADS award. We're also going to have a look at other conditions of the modern award and how they apply for you. We're looking at the award review coming out of November last year and the changes to the modern award that we have seen out of that. We're also going to have a look at the April modern award review and we're still awaiting the outcome of some of those decisions. Lastly, we're going to have a look at some implementation issues just to give you something to think about in terms of moving across to the modern award. We'll have a look at the equal remuneration order and specifically how that implements for yourself. In terms of industrial obligation and funding, we'll be having a look at how it works around the different states. So in terms of the transition timetable, you can see classifications, we had to have classified under the SCHADS Modern Award as of July last year. So you had to have moved from your old SACS and crisis accommodation classifications across to the SCHADS Modern Award classifications from July last year. Pay rates, including the equal remuneration order, commenced phasing from July last year. So where your old award was lower, you needed to go to the modern award rate from July last year, and we'll continue to head towards the modern award full equal remuneration order in December 2020. In terms of penalty rates and loadings, these commenced phasing from July last year and that will continue right through until July 2014. In terms of allowances, all allowances have applied in the modern award since January 2010. However, some district allowances in the Northern Territory continue to be preserved until July 2014 in line with the transitional provisions under the modern SCHADS award. All other provisions of the modern award have applied since January 2010 with the exception of some of the aspects of the South Australia and Tasmanian redundancy severance payments which are preserved again under those transitional provisions until July 2014 where they are more generous. So in moving from your old Tasmanian award, you can see the old awards had a loading of afternoon 15% and a night shift of 20%. The modern award, however, only provides for a 12.5% afternoon shift and a 15% night shift. So the way we need to move from that 15% down to the 12.5%, it's a proportional phased amount. So from July last year, we stopped applying that 15%. And we moved down to a 13.5%. Of course, you need to take note that the old afternoon shift did apply that loading between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. However, the modern award only applies it from 8 p.m. to midnight. So there is a phasing out of that particular loading for those 2 hours. So you can see that's gone from 15% down to 6%. From July this year, that'll go down to a 3%, and then that 2-hour loading will cease to apply from July next year. The modern award afternoon shift from this year moves to 13%, and then thankfully come July next year we'll be sitting on the modern award 12.5%. Night shift, as we said, was a 20% loading, however it's only 15% in the modern award. So what we're seeing as of July last year was that 15% phasing in, but that 20% phasing out. So the modern award phasing in is currently at 9% and from July this year will go to 12%. The night shift 20% will go down to an 8% and then from July this year will go down to 4%. So as of July this year you can see you'll be applying a 16% loading. From July next year it will be a 15% loading in line with the modern award only. Public holidays, Saturdays and Sunday continue to be the same in Tasmania as they've always been under the modern award. In terms of the casual loading and shift penalties, you can see under the casual loading was 20%. From July this year it went to July last year went to 23%. From July this year it'll go to a 24%. And you can see here, these are the modern award applications. So that casual loading will go to a 25%. Now you can see here there is no casual loading provided for. Sorry, there's casual loading but no weekend loading provided for casuals. So technically Saturday and Sunday loading do phase down to zero in line with the modern award. However, that is at the time of printing. And we'll have a look at the April award review where the ASU's application deals with reinserting these. But certainly as it is at the moment, true casuals, so that is those that are not regularly and systematically rostered, you can phase down the weekend loading. And the way we're doing that is from July last year we applied a 20 and a 40% on Sunday. From July this year it'll be a 10% and a 20% loading. And then from July next year it'll be a 0% unless that's changed in line with the move to the modern award update. However, if you have casuals that are regularly and systematically rostered, you should get the advice from your employer association. It's exceptionally unlikely that you'll be able to phase these loadings down, and this is probably what you're going to need to maintain. Again, same for the old SACS Northern Territory. You can see the modern award was 15%, but the way that loading applied is completely different in line with the modern award, which is a shift that finishes after 8 p.m. and midnight. So as you can see, same as Tasmania, we're headed towards the modern award 12.5% and the night shift modern award amount of 15% from the old 30% night shift in Northern Territory. So again, we're phasing down that 30%. So from July this year, that loading will go down to 6%. However, we're increasing the 15% in line with the modern award to 12%. So given we're so close to July, you can see from July this year, you'll be applying an 18%. But you can see here the modern award application of 15% is what will be applied from July next year. Same with afternoon shift. The only thing to be mindful of, as I say, is the hours that used to apply between 5 p.m. and midnight. Now it only applies between 8 p.m. and midnight. So the modern award, you can see we're phasing in that 12.5. From July this year, we'll be applying a 10% loading from that 12.5% increase to the modern award, and phasing down from the afternoon shift in the modern award, it will be sitting on a 3% loading. So from July this year, we'll be applying a 13% loading, headed towards the modern award 12.5. The public holidays maintains the same at 150% loading. However, what you can see here is that Saturday and Sunday, Saturday loading is no longer going to be 75%. You'll be applying a 60% loading. From July this year, that'll go down to 55% loading. And then from July 2014, it's the modern award application of 50% loading. And Sunday, you can see, is 100% loading in line with the modern award. So from July last year, that 75 increased to 90. And then from July this year, that'll go to 95%. And then thankfully, we can't wait till 2014. We'll all be sitting on the modern award applications. Again, in line with the old casual loading, you can see it was 20%. We're headed towards the modern award 25%. So from July this year, we'll be looking at a 24% application of the modern award phased amount, headed towards that 25. Again, just pausing for a second. The casual weekend loading, you can see, isn't provided for at the time of printing. However, so you'll be phasing those down to 30% loadings and then 15% from this July. However, that is subject to the modern award review of April, which we're anticipating the outcome of shortly. In terms of the Northern Territory, there used to be a 10% loading that applied to levels 6, 7 and 8. That obviously doesn't apply anymore in the modern award, and it was in lieu of roughly 2 hours of overtime. However, you can see that application is now a 2% loading, and from July next year it will be a 0 application. However, all of those employees do become subject to overtime the same way as other employees will be, so that will be overtime on toil. In terms of the ACT, it's the same application. So we used to have an afternoon shift of 20% and a permanent afternoon shift of 30%. However, these provisions don't apply in the modern award. It is only a 12.5% loading. So again, as we've already looked at for the other two states, we phase those loadings down proportionately. These are the figures from July last year, 15.5 and 19.5. However, from July this year, we'll be looking at a 14% and a 16% drop. And then, as we say, come July 2014, we'll only be sitting on the modern award application. You can see for the afternoon shift, for a shift that ends between 7:30 and 8 p.m, the modern award doesn't apply loading to those hours, so therefore we need to phase out that 20% or that 30%, depending on it being a permanent or an afternoon shift. So currently we'd be applying an 8% and a 12%. However, we'll go down from July this year to a 4% and a 6%, and we'll see that removed altogether from July next year. The night shift was 20%, needs to go to 15% in line with the move to the modern award. You'd be applying 17% loading to a night shift at the moment, and from July this year that'll go down to 16%. Public holidays is maintained at 150%. Only difference to weekend loading here is a Saturday morning remains the same at 50%. However, in the ACT, a Saturday afternoon used to get a 100% loading. It will only get the 50% application, so we phased that down from July last year to 70%, and from July this year that will see that go to a 60% loading. And then, as we keep saying, come July next year, it's the modern award application of 50%. Again, casual loading has always been 25% in the ACT, and that's maintained. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time here, but you can see same loadings used to apply to casuals on a weekend. However, they're not provided for, as I say, at the time of today's webinar. But watch this space to see what happens with the modern award review of April this year. If you do have true casuals, you can phase those loadings down to 20%, 40% and 40% as of last year. And from July this year, you'll see a 10%, 20% and 20%. We're all headed towards the zero application of weekend loadings for casuals. In terms of SACS South Australia, again, it's the same application. We're moving from the old provisions, which are outlined here, across to the modern award application. So that would be the afternoon shift of 12.5% and a night shift of 15%. No provision for permanent or afternoon shift loadings. It's exactly the same as afternoon and night shift loadings, so they don't see a higher application of loading, if you see that here. So we're moving from these 30% right down to 12.5% and 15%. So our phase down amount at the moment, just looking at permanent afternoon shift, has gone from 30% down to a 19.5%. From July this year, that'll go to 16%. And then from July next year, the modern award application of 12.5% will apply. Again, the permanent night shift was 30%. From July last year, that phased down to 21%. From July this year, that'll go down to 18%. And then from July next year, thankfully, again, we end up on the modern award application of 15%. Public holidays is 50% and maintains. Saturdays maintains the 50% loading. Sundays moves from a 50% loading to 100% loading. And again, phasing that in proportionate amounts, you should be paying an 80% loading for July last year. From July last year, from July this year, you'll be applying a 9% loading for work done on a Sunday. And then from July next year, we'll be looking at the 100% loading. Again, casuals, you can see, went from a 20%, you'll currently be applying a 23%. From July this year, you'll go to a 24%, and then we'll be sitting on the modern award 25% casual loading from July next year. Again, you can see no weekend loading for casuals is the current situation, but watch this space. In terms of the modern award review of November last year, what it did clarify is that an employee can work before or after a sleepover, so both sides of that sleepover. The sleepover, as we know, must be of 8 hours duration. What it did clarify is that one of those engagement periods, either before or after, must be at least a minimum of 4-hour engagement period. Potentially, someone can work up to a 10-hour shift by agreement. So it could be that someone does a 10-hour stand-up shift, an 8-hour sleepover shift, or alternatively, a 9-hour stand-up, an 8-hour sleepover, and a 1-hour handover at the end. you could do 4 hours before a sleepover and 4 hours after a sleepover. It just clarified that one of those periods, either side of a sleepover, must be of a minimum of 4 hours engagement. It also clarified that the 10-hour break between shifts can be reduced to an 8-hour break between shifts where it's in association with a sleepover, but it must be agreed to with the employee, and we would encourage you to get that in writing with the employee, that it has been agreed to be reduced from a 10-hour break between shifts to an 8-hour break between shifts. The other thing that was clarified is just because someone goes into a private residence or into outreach doesn't mean that that will necessarily push them into Schedule E or the home care section. If someone's going into a client's private home and providing cooking, cleaning and personal care, it is possible that they go into home care, but you really need to sit down with that person's position description and have a look at it. If they're providing the higher level assistance to living, taking them out to appointments, writing up the care plans, it's very likely that they'll be pushed into the SACS part of the SCHADS modern award. The other thing that the modern award review did classify as of November last year is that loadings payable for a broken shift are determined by the end of the shift, and also that 24-hour care provisions can only apply to home care workers. The modern award review of April this year, as I said, part-time employment at the moment has no minimum engagement period. However, the ASU's application seeks to apply the same minimum engagement periods as casuals. So that would be a 3, a 2 or a 1 hour minimum engagement each time a part-time employee works, depending on which part of the modern award that they are classified under. The small employer redundancy application by the ASU seeks to reinsert small employer redundancies for organisations of less than 15. And while those provisions for redundancy are less than the NES, it at least provides some redundancy payment for employees of small employers. The ASU have also applied to have penalty rates or an allowance applied to broken shifts. Now, as I said at the time of printing, there are no casual penalty rates for a weekend. So when a casual works on the weekend at the moment, they only get the casual loading. And the ASU's application seeks to reinsert those weekend loadings for casuals. Annual leave and public holidays are also up for review in terms of shift workers. We hope to know the outcome of these things shortly, and we'll be sure to communicate that out to people. In terms of implementation issues, organisations have been talking to us about rostering arrangements. So we had a look at for the various states where the shift loadings applied and to what hours they applied. What organisations have been asking is, do those rostering arrangements still make sense under the SCHADS, and is there scope to make some savings around when the hours and the shift loadings apply? So can we move hours to reduce unnecessary burden of shift loading while still meeting the needs of clients? Another thing to potentially have a look at in terms of making some savings is moving long-term casuals across to permanent part-time employment. And really that's about an organisation making the cost saving of the casual loading, but at the same time being able to meet the needs of the clients through that flexibility of part-time employment that's provided for in the modern award. Obviously it's part of a process, you can't unilaterally come along and move people over, but you need to take those casuals along with you in terms of moving them over to part-time employment and consulting with them around that. Job design and classification, that's really about looking at the position descriptions that you do have and the job designs you have and making sure that they're going to meet the needs of your organisation going forward. So in terms of the equal remuneration order, the modern award rates increase by 23 to 45%, and the full amount becomes payable in December 2020, and that is phased in 9 equal instalments on the 1st of December each year. And pay rates are affected by transitional arrangements moving from your old awards across to the SCHADS award. In terms of your old award rates, they were maintained as what we call transitional award rates if they were higher than the modern award rate. However, if they were lower than the modern award rate, you had to move to the modern award rate from the 1st of July 2012. And the important thing to note here is that transitional rates do increase, but they increase at a slower rate than the modern award rate. But thankfully, we do all arrive at the same payment point in December 2020. So in terms of doing the actual calculation, this is how, for those of you who feel the need to calculate it yourself, A is where we will be come December 2020, so what the full equal remuneration payment looks like. B is the current award rate or where we are now. So that's either going to be the modern award or your preserved transitional award payment. So the way to do the actual equal remuneration order calculation is, what will the full ERO look like come December 2020 minus where someone is now, and that'll give us a difference. Then we divide that difference by 1/9, because remember we're giving it over the 9 years each December. So then we divide it by the 1/9 and add it back to where someone currently is. In year 2 it's exactly the same calculation, so the difference again, divided by 1/9, only difference is we multiply it by 2. In year 3 we multiply it by 3, and etc. I think this is really important. This quite clearly sets out what we're talking about, but in a more visual way that I think is easier to understand. So this is what the full ERO modern SCHADS award will look like come December 2020. You can see that's quite a high rate of pay. This is the current modern award rate. You can see it sits substantially below where the full ERO will be. So we need to get from here up to the full ERO amount. And the way we do that is we take that difference and divide it into 9 equal instalments. So you can see each one of these is 9 chunks of the pie. This is where the current above award rates or the transitional rates are. So for those of you whose award rates were higher than the modern award rate, we still need to get to the same point in December 2020, but the way we get there obviously is there's less of a way to go. We still get there in 9 equal instalments, so we just divide that difference up into the 9 equal instalments, or if you like, 9 smaller chunks of the pie. So you can see it's substantially smaller, but we are all moving to that one rate come December 2020. So just as a representation, a SCHADS level 2 will move by 23% or 2.6 each year, and right through to a level 8 that moves by 45% or 5% each year. But obviously the amount of each increase will depend on where you started from in terms of your transitional rates. So what we're looking at here, just as an example, we've used New South Wales as an example because it does start from a much higher base. This is the modern award, and you can see it's moving at quite a high rate, and the reason for that is it had quite a way to go to get up to the full ERO amount come December 2020, and I do apologise, this graph is slightly off. However, it starts from a much higher base, so it will move twice each year in the same way that the modern award will. So the July national minimum wage increase and the December ERO increase. It's just that it moves at a slower proportionate rate as it doesn't have as far to go and it started from a higher base. In terms of pay rates, you can get pay tables off our NDS. We've provided pay tables to NDS. There's the website link up above. And we present the most likely translations together with the applicable pay rates. So just having a look at that, for example, this is the old Tasmanian, it's level 1 and level 2. So you can see here level 2 and a 2B. A 2B can translate anywhere between a 2 and a level 3, and that's really dependent upon the type of role that they have and the level of responsibility that those tasks carry. So what you need to know is, if a 2B translates to a 2, what are the applicable rates of pay at each pay point? If a 2B translates to a level 3, what are the applicable rates for that pay point as well? And we're just showing you these. These are not a full example of the pay table. This is just to give you an idea of what they look like. We also show you the casual loading as it stands at the correct date. If you don't have access to our pay tables, you can see what I've put up here is the Fair Work Ombudsman's website, and you can get the information off there. It'll actually ask you to choose which of the award is applicable for your state. And once you have done that, it'll ask you to put in where someone used to be classified. And in this example, we've used the Northern Territory SACS. So this is a Community Services Worker Grade 4 Pay Point 1. who translated to a grade 4 pay point 1 under the SACS Modern Award, or SCHADS SACS part of the Modern Award. Once you put all that in, it will tell you what their applicable rates of pay were for both July and December. Now, if you're trying to translate a community services worker grade 4 down to a SCHADS level 1, or alternatively, ridiculously, a grade 4 up to a SCHADS level 8, the computer will actually tell you, the Ombudsman's calculator tells you these do not compute. So you'll need to go back and have a look at, have you correctly classified someone. In terms of your industrial obligations and funding, the Commonwealth has given its commitment to fully fund its share, including directly funded and jointly funded programs. And that's part of the 8-year phase-in to assist unfunded programs to be able to cope with that budgetary constraints, as well as government budgeting to allow for that. The Commonwealth Supplementation is based on 3 components. It's been calculated on a SACS level 4. So first thing they look at is the ERO increase and the applicable rate for a level 4. Now, for the first ERO instalment was only a 7-month period, and so that equated to 1.64%. Then they look at the proportion of the program funding that they say is allocated to SACS wages, and that's what they apportion it to, multiplied by the grant amount. So represented here, it's 1.64%, multiplied by the 70% that they say is allocated to wages, multiplied by the $1 million grant, or if you like, for that 7-month period, it's $11,480. For the 12-month period, it would be approximately $31,000. Again, that would depend on the national minimum wage increase, which we expect to have announced shortly. In terms of state supplementation, the South Australian Government, there's agreement on the Commonwealth funding offer, and there's ongoing discussions over the conditions sought by the Commonwealth. In terms of Northern Territory, paid funding based on the Territory's component only, and a committee has been established to access the cost of component, including the Commonwealth share. In terms of ACT and TAS, both have paid their respective funding components, including the Commonwealth share. So in terms of MI in scope, funding agencies are only required to provide supplementation to programs that are expected to employ SACS workers, and there's no commitment to supplement where they're industrially not obliged to. So if they're not expected to, if you're not expected to employ SACS workers, if those workers are perhaps home care, then you'll find that you're not going to get that supplementation for that program. 2 things you can look at is, have you correctly classified people under the right award? So what's the industry that we're in? There are other awards that can cover our industry, such as labour market assistance, aged care, nurses and health professionals. And the way to do that is to work out what is the industry defined by the award. So obviously if we're in the social, community, home care and disability services, that'll get us into the SCHADS part of the award. The second thing you need to look at is there classification descriptions that can cover that employee within the award. So that'll cover all your clerical type in workers. However, if you had a bus driver, for example, if you opened up the SCHADS classifications, you'd see there is no description that could cover bus driver, so you'd need to go and find the applicable award that would cover that person. The other thing you need to look at is, if the SCHADS does apply, ensure that you've correctly classified people under the correct schedule of the modern award. So we looked at Schedule E is home care and Schedule B is the SACS part. So you need to make sure that you do have correctly classified people under home care or SACS or vice versa. In terms of your industrial obligation and funding, if you're receiving sufficient funding, unfortunately employees still have an industrial entitlement to be paid those correct rates of pay, and you don't have the discretion to underpay due to the lack of funding. So we looked at some of the options for making potential savings to be able to fund the ERO. Things like rearranging shifts, moving casuals over to permanent part-time employees to try and look at meeting the needs of the clients while perhaps freeing up some funds so that you can redirect funds in other ways. Other options such as finding revenue or absorbing or drawing on reserves, or reducing wages billed through attrition. Obviously nobody wants to go through a restructure, but if you find yourself in the position of having to go through a restructure within your organisation, you should definitely get that advice from your employer association. The Fair Work Act does contain some very stringent rules about how you need to consult with the employees. It's really important that you do that. And keep in mind, employees are employed by your organisation, not by the funding body, so the responsibility really does lie with your organisation. I'm just putting up for you now some resources. So there's the NDS website, the Fair Work Ombudsman's website, obviously the Jobs Australia website and the FWO-ERO website. Hopefully today you've had all your questions answered, and I thank you for listening.